20 years ago, the first ever Chinese astronaut went into orbit. And since then, China's space program has skyrocketed. The country now operates its own space station, has rovers on Mars, and plans to put boots on the moon by 2030. In fact, the US says the speed, scale, and ambition of China's space program have entered a new phase, which US military leaders have called mind-boggling. So what do we know about China's space program, and will it unseat the US as the world's top space superpower? I'm Divya Gopalan, and you're watching Connected on TaiwanPlus. A bird's eye view of China's space program and its trajectory, we're joined from Seoul, South Korea by Blaine Curcio. He's the senior advisor for Novaspace and founder of Orbital Gateway Consulting. Great to have you on the program, Blaine.
Great to be here. Thanks a lot for the invite.
Right. So I'm going to start off with, aside from you being a space expert and a satellite communications consultant, you also regularly publish a newsletter called the China Space Monitor. Can you tell us why you decided to focus on China's space program and also the difficulties in getting information from there?
So I was an international business major at my undergraduate during my undergraduate, and I had a couple of professors that were telling me at that time, this was about 15 years ago, that China was going to be the place to go in the 21st century. And so I went over to Hong Kong for an exchange program, really fell in love with the place. And so when I finished uni, I moved back to Hong Kong, and then I lived in Shenzhen for quite a few years. While in Shenzhen, I was covering the global space industry, so mostly looking at the satellite communications part of that. At the time, this would have been early 2010s, there was not so much happening in the Chinese space sector. This was before the kind of commercial space boom. But nonetheless, living in Shenzhen, I learned Chinese. I learned a lot about the culture, the economy, the system there. And as the commercial space sector started to boom, I was just in the right place at the right time. And so I figured, well, I might as well give this a shot. To the second part of your question about some of the challenges that I face when covering the Chinese space sector, I think the biggest challenge for me is there's so many different companies that like to claim stake in different projects. And so you could have a satellite that was launched and you'll have three companies saying, oh, we're operating that satellite. And so trying to disentangle who's really doing what, who's really involved in which project, who is building which satellites, that can be a surprisingly opaque or at a minimum confusing exercise. And especially when, again, you could have multiple companies saying they built that satellite. And oftentimes there's a lot of parsing to see, okay, well, actually, this company was building the satellite platform and this company was building some of the systems. And maybe they're all telling the truth, but it's just getting to the bottom of what truth are they actually saying. So I think that's been the biggest challenge.
Well, that's a great setup into what's happening on the ground there in China. But before we do that, let's take a look at some figures here. Now, currently, the US and China dominate the global space race. Here are the number of rockets launched by the two countries in 2024. The US leads with 145 launches out of the overall 263 orbital attempts made by different countries. But what's interesting is that 138 or 95% of those American launches were conducted by SpaceX. That's Elon Musk's company. China, though, was a distant second, launching 68 spacecraft. That's one more than the year before. Now, these figures are tracked and published by the researcher and astronomer Jonathan McDowell. Now, Blaine, both countries are competing, as you can see, in rocket launches. But what are the numbers shaping up for 2025? And what do these numbers tell you about the space race?
So in 2025, as of today, let's say, so China has made 76 attempts at launch, and 74 of those attempts have been successful. And so to your earlier graphic, it's a relatively small, but still decent increase over last year. The US, I don't track as closely, but I checked earlier today on Wikipedia, take that for what it's worth. But the US in 2025 has attempted 182 launches, of which 178 have been successful. So clearly, US is gaining in some sense, and China, while growing their total number of launches, it's not growing as quickly. I think to your point a moment ago, however, about the US being so dominated by SpaceX, this is a big difference between the US and China, where most of the rockets are Long March rockets. They're built by CASC, the big state-owned enterprise, and their various subsidiaries. But you have between 15 and 20 fairly serious commercial launch companies, of which between 6 and 8 are now launching at least once per year. And some of them are launching, 5, 6, 7 times per year. And, in the next couple of years, you could credibly imagine some of those companies starting to launch 15 or 20 times per year. And so assuming that the Long March rockets continue to gradually ramp up from, say, 60, 70 per year to maybe 100 per year within a couple of years, if you then throw on top of that, say, another 50 or 100 commercial rockets, I mean, it's not inconceivable that China would be launching, say, 200 times by, say, 2027, 2028. And that would be a pretty substantial increase, as we saw from last year and also from this year.
NASA is currently facing a possible 25% cut in their budget. And also, much of that cut would come from the agency's science program, where they could possibly see, if Congress passes these proposals, a 47% drop in funding. So do you think that the U.S. is relying more on in the commercial space, or hoping that their space exploration is driven by the commercial sector? And how would that compare to China? Is China likely to stay on track with mostly, government initiatives and some commercial players?
For sure, the U.S. is I think, is clearly trying to rely more on the commercial sector, and that's a long-term trend that we've seen for a couple of decades now. And I think, if anything, that's going to only increase moving forward. And you're seeing really ambitious commercial companies in the U.S. now doing things like commercial space stations or commercial lunar landers, this type of thing. I mean, stuff that 25 years ago would have been unimaginable. On the Chinese side of things, for sure, there's still going to be a large and strategically dominant state-owned space sector. So the Long March rockets are still going to be the biggest, baddest rockets in China. And I think that the commercial side, there's a different relationship between the government and the commercial side. So looking back to the US for a moment, the government, to your point, has really explicitly said, we want this or that capability from commercial space companies, and we will pay for this or that capability if a company can go develop, launches at a certain price, or, launches to a certain orbit, this type of thing. So really a very demand side focused support from the government for commercial sector. In China, it's much more on the supply side. So the government has typically said at a national level, we want more commercial space activity. And then at a provincial and city level, you have governments that are writing checks to commercial space companies to help them get stood up, or giving them some subsidized or free land for a factory. Or you have the Chinese Academy of Sciences giving them free office space, or in some cases free space in a kind of laboratory. Or you have some city government giving subsidies to every master's degree student that a space company hires. You have all kinds of these relatively small, but then in aggregate, actually quite large subsidies that companies can capitalize on. And so, again, compared to the US, it's more supply side in China. You don't have the government saying, we want to buy this capability from commercial companies. You have the government saying, we want companies to figure out the commercialization piece, and we will help them in sort of a sandbox mode along the way by giving them rebates on every satellite that they build in our city, or by giving them insurance premium subsidies on any insurance that they buy for a launch, this type of thing. And so I think that, broadly speaking, these are the two different systems that we see, and I think that it's reflected in the way that commercial space is done in both places.
Now, whichever way they get there, both countries seem to be competing in institute building efforts. Now, with the US-led Artemis Accords on lunar exploration squaring up against Chinese and Russian-led International Lunar Research Station. Now, who do you see making the biggest developments in this area, given that they have very different approaches from what it looks like?
So I think that China has certainly been more slow and steady, if you will. I mean, they've had now multiple Chang'e missions that have been part of the first phase of the International Lunar Research Station. So the long-term roadmap for the ILRS that has included in phase 1, Chang'e 6, which was last year, Chang'e 7, and et cetera. And so there has been a very progressive march forward there with quite some impressive technological achievements. I mean, returning with the samples from the far side of the moon as the first country to do that's certainly noteworthy. On the U.S. side, admittedly, I don't cover the industry as closely, but it seems like there's a lot more political uncertainty. There's a lot less stability, but at the same time, you do have more freedom for commercial companies to do what they want. And if it makes commercial sense to go to the moon or to send people to the moon or to build a lunar communications network, that type of thing, probably commercial companies in the US will do it. Whereas, in China, it's much more top down. It's much more, we want to do this as a point of national pride, as a point of potentially staking our claim to certain parts of the moon, potentially, soft power, all the different reasons you might want to do it. So two very different approaches. And I think that up until now, the U.S. probably still has a more, let's say, more of the necessary ingredients currently ready that would be needed to send people to the moon. But I think that if we look at the trajectory that China has been on, and also just the stability with which they have stayed on that trajectory, it's not hard to imagine China sending people to the moon by the end of the decade. And so that's something to think about.
Now, during the Cold War space race, while the U.S. used the term astronaut, Russia called their space travel cosmonaut, and China's calling their space travelers taikonauts. Now, beside linguistic pride, can you tell us what the major differences are? And I know this is kind of coming in from more of an overall view in how they train and decide on who is going to space.
In terms of the system, I would say Chinese taikonauts are generally a little bit more closed off from the rest of the world during their careers. I mean, you do occasionally now see long retired taikonauts going to conferences and saying hello, and even in some cases, getting pictures with foreigners. But in general, if you're a taikonaut today, or if you've been a taikonaut any time in the recent past, you're not even allowed to interact with foreigners. Period, as far as I understand. I would say a couple of other interesting specific anecdotes around China's taikonaut selection. It would have been earlier this year that China they made their first agreement with an international partner, Pakistan in that case, to train or to select and train Pakistani, I guess, taikonauts, as it were, to go to the Chinese space station. And then last year there was an open call for Hong Kong citizens to become taikonauts, and there was a female police officer, I think, from Hong Kong who was selected for the taikonaut training program. And so, to their credit, there's a certain opening up of the taikonaut corps, but it's still very much people that are typically being selected from the PLA or the PLA Air Force or similar, and then being put through rigorous training. They have to the northwest of Beijing, there's the space city, Hangtianteng, where there's all of the taikonaut training facilities. And then you have a few other areas around the country where they train taikonauts. But it is relatively opaque in terms of how that's done.
And which of China's space investments would you say, be it like Shenzhou or Chang'e, do you think has boosted the country most, or helped it really launch its space program?
So probably, the Long March series of rockets is a workhorse, and it's had a really, really impressive track record. There's a bunch of different Long Marches, so it's not necessarily correct to say just the Long March. But there have been. I was looking at the numbers the other day. I think only like one failure in the last 10 years of any of the Long March rockets, and that's having had 250 successes or something like that. It's a really impressive track record, and I think that's a very important thing to having a stable and consistent space program, because you can have all the satellites you want, you can have all the astronauts trained that you want, you can have all the space stations, but if you don't have a stable supply of launch vehicles, quite literally, you're never going to get your space program off the ground. And so I think that's probably the biggest one. Other big pieces of infrastructure that I think have paid off quite well. The BeiDou satellite navigation constellation, which was first launched in the late 2000s, but then this most recent third generation was launched largely in the late 2010s. That is now, in some ways it outperforms GPS. Many, I mean, basically all smartphones sold in China today are compatible with the BeiDou constellation, and there's a lot of downstream BeiDou services and applications that have been exported to, Belt and Road, broadly speaking, countries or others. But, you have even years ago, China Great Wall Industry, a state-owned enterprise, they set up a subsidiary in either Laos or Cambodia to be exporting BeiDou chipsets and transceivers and so on into the logistics industry in that country. And so that's really been, I think, an important soft power win, but also in some ways a technological win.
Yeah, and looking further in how China hopes to use its space exploration on Earth, the Shenzhou 21 crew were joined by 4 mice to be used in experimenting in reproduction in low Earth orbit. Now, how important are these scientific goals compared to exploration or military interests? And what are the interesting kind of, I would say, experiments or perhaps discoveries that they're trying to find using space?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And yeah, those mice, it's like that story. I forget who's told it at some point, but saying, oh, let's send some mice to Mars and they could make it there, and they would, people are saying, well, they'll all be dead by the time they get to Mars. It's like, well, no, they're going to be able to reproduce during the journey to Mars, and so by the time they get to Mars, it'll be the 10th generations of mice. But hey, they're going to be on Mars. So, but digressing to your point, I mean, a couple of things come to mind about the experiments being done on the Chinese space station. So there's a whole world of interesting stuff going on in microgravity manufacturing and research. So things like potentially growing retinas for human eyes in space, because doing that in microgravity, it allows for much more precise positioning of, I think it's proteins, as you try to build out the retinas. Or I was talking to someone yesterday, he was saying that for things like very high-end semiconductors being manufactured in space, because there's something about it's easy to have a complete vacuum when you're in space, and that's apparently very expensive and difficult to do on Earth. So microgravity manufacturing and research is an area that it is very much still kind of sci-fi, but it's also coming a lot more quickly than we expect. And so I think that would be one interesting and important part of that. The other thing that I think is worth noting is international experiments being done on the Chinese space station. So there was a very impressive and thorough PDF document published 6-7 years ago now, maybe, but maybe not that much. But anyway, English language document of all the different research racks that are on the Chinese space station. And very clearly it was targeting non-Chinese research institutions, saying, hey, if you have some research that you want to do on orbit, you could send it to the International Space Station and that's all fine. But hey, we have the Chinese space station here. It's brand spanking new. Here's all the research racks. Here's all the interesting things that you can do. And so from a soft power perspective, that's nice. And also from a, positioning China as a nexus of broader scientific and technological research, it certainly is an impressive piece of infrastructure. And especially when you consider that, there's not many other countries that can afford having a space station. And so if you're a mid-sized, European or developed or developing country and you want to do some microgravity research, that's an interesting value proposition to be considering.
So interesting. Now, since crewed missions are only a fraction of the total, let's take a look at the number and types of satellite launches by China between 2022 and 2024. And this is based on analysis by Orbital Gateway Consulting. Among the 270 satellites the PRC sent to space in 2024, 105 were communication satellites. Now, that's a steep increase from just 26 in 2023. But there was a slight decrease in the number of remote sensing satellites from 142 in 2023 to 117 last year. Now, can you just give us a readout on those numbers there and what that says to you about China's space program?
Sure. So first, looking at the increase in communication satellites, it speaks to the acceleration in the so-called Chinese versions of Starlink. So that would be the Guowang or the SatNet constellation, and also the Tianfan or the Thousand Sails constellation. So these are two low Earth orbit communications constellations that really started to accelerate last year. And those constellations, by their very nature, they're going to require many hundreds, or I mean, they say, more than 10,000 satellites. And so this should be, the beginning of a longer term trend. And we've seen that trend continue in 2025, I might add. In terms of the decline in remote sensing, I mean, part of it is a little bit anomalous. So there's a company, CGSTL, Changguang Weixing. They built and launched 150-ish remote sensing satellites in their own constellation between 2022 and 2024. And 2024 was kind of the tail end of that. And once they had that whole constellation on orbit, they didn't really need to continue launching as many remote sensing satellites. And so, again, most of those satellites came in the first 2 years on this chart. The third year, it was kind of filling in the constellation. And so that led to a bit of a decline. And so I think we would expect to see in a few years, when that constellation starts to reach its end of life, there would be a renewed pickup in remote sensing satellites, which would also be a little bit bolstered by a few other similar projects, but basically just kind of structural factors that are causing that.
Well, what's interesting about China's space program is that it's very much linked with, like you said, with the military in a sense. Like a lot of concern is that whatever breakthroughs that happen in space can immediately be fed into for the PLA's military activities or for the defense. Firstly, can you explain kind of that tie-in on how it's very much intertwined, the military aspirations along with their commercial space aspirations?
Sure. So it's pretty opaque, but I mean, there's a couple of things that you can point to. So the four main launch sites, for example, so Jiuquan, Wenchang, Xichang, and Taiyuan, they are all still at least nominally controlled by the PLA. And from what I understand, when speaking with launch companies, it can be a bit of a headache to get all of the necessary paperwork to get access to those launch sites. And so that can create some issues. In terms of the sort of the integration or the linking of these two entities, the military and the space sector, and let's say the commercial space sector more specifically, I mean, it's less explicit than in the U.S. Insofar as, again, in the U.S. you have the Space Force or some other military entity is more or less publicly saying, we want to buy this type of technology from this space company. And you can look at Starshield, the Starlink sub-constellation for the DoD as one such example. In China, it's obviously a lot more behind the curtains, under the radar, however you want to describe it. That being said, quite a few of these commercial space companies are trying to go public with IPOs, and they've published fairly detailed, or in some cases extremely detailed, prospectuses. And some of them have been kind enough to break out their revenues by, civil versus military, or some of them, call it, military industrial revenues, or, other phrases that are very clearly linking it to the military. And you can see that the military, broadly speaking, is procuring either remote sensing imagery or electronics or other technology from these commercial space companies. We've also started to see a little bit in the last few years, either commercial satellite manufacturers that are building these kind of dual use technology satellites. So like the Shijian or Shiyan series of satellites, which are again, always very opaque, but typically they're just described as being, new technology or something like that. You've seen commercial manufacturers build those satellites occasionally, and also commercial rockets are now occasionally launching those types of satellites. So we are starting to see baby steps of the military, outwardly and publicly in ways that are verifiable, leveraging the commercial space sector.
I'm curious, given that the U.S. did that a few decades ago already, why is it so much on the U.S.'s agenda? And from what you know of China's space program, how realistic is it within the next few years to see China's moon landing with boots on the ground?
Sure. So on the U.S. side, I would venture to say that it's largely seen as important because it's a stepping off point to get in, further out into space. I mean, it's going to be a lot easier to send lots of things out into the solar system if you have a sort of foundational base set up on the moon, whether it's in lunar orbit or on the moon itself. On the China side, I mean, they're doing a lot of different things to prepare for crewed space missions to the moon, but also just longer term, bigger activities on the moon. I mean, the most obvious would be that they're building or they're developing bigger rockets, and that's going to be needed. As I mentioned earlier, you've had these Chang'e missions, of which there have now been 6. And the different Chang'e missions have explored different parts of the moon. They've taken back lunar samples that have allowed researchers to get a better understanding of lunar regoliths, so the soil of which the moon is made. And then you've also had the ability to explore the moon and send back a lot of data. I mean, these Chang'e missions, again, so they've been looking for good areas to land people on the moon, looking for places to set up a base, this type of thing. And also, searching for maybe if there's a crater that you could set up a base, but there's some, wall of that crater that's on an angle that's not really apparent from Earth. And it's almost like trying to find potential sand traps, for lack of a better term, for a crewed mission. The other thing that I think is particularly interesting is lunar communications satellites. So China has launched 3 of these DROs, of distant retrograde orbit satellites, that are essentially communication satellites that are meant to beam back signals from the moon, whether it's from the Chang'e rovers or whether it's from eventual humans on the moon. And this is one of those things that maybe goes overlooked by the general public, that if you have people on the moon, you need to have a communication network to help them communicate with the Earth. And it really helps to have satellites that are close to the moon.
What else is on China's agenda that has caught your imagination as what they're hoping to achieve over the next few years?
So a couple of specific technologies that they've talked about a lot. Space computing, so the idea of either having data centers in space or having the ability for satellites to analyze and compute data before sending it down to Earth. So, for example, you have lots of remote sensing satellites that are taking petabytes and petabytes of image data over everywhere on Earth all the time. And then those satellites need to send that data back to Earth. And a lot of those images, they're going to be obstructed by cloud cover, or they're going to be, taken at night, or there's different things that make them useless. And having more intelligent computing on orbit on these satellites will let them basically say, all right, 70% of what we take in terms of imagery is not even worth sending back to Earth. Let's make this much more efficient and only send the 30% back to Earth. So having that kind of capability is I think, one of those overlooked things that they've been pushing for quite a lot recently. Things like laser communications. So that would be very important for Starlink-like constellations to have the ability to communicate between satellites with lasers, also potentially between satellites and the ground using lasers, and then also to communicate between satellites and the moon or further out using lasers. I mean, radio frequency travels fast, but it does not travel as fast as the speed of light. And so if you have a spacecraft that's millions of miles away, the latency or the kind of signal delay that you would have if you're using traditional RF is quite significant. And so if you can have lasers, you can have a faster signal, you can have a higher bandwidth signal. So lasers are going to allow that a much higher bandwidth to be sent. And it's just, in general, it makes a lot of sense to be developing laser communications. Other technologies, I would say, the modularity of China's space assets is quite impressive, and it shows some level of long-term thinking. So if you look at the Chinese space station, at the moment, there's 3 cabins, or there's 3 modules, let's say, in addition to the different spacecraft they send, like the Shenzhou spacecraft. But you have the Tianhe core module, the 1Tian and the Mengtian lab modules. But it's designed to be able to expand by having a duplicate of Tianhe attached to one side of it, which would give them a lot more space. Could have a lot more several more astronauts on there, and you could, in the future they could have more lab modules. I mean, basically, you can tell that this was designed as a very long-term project. And the same is true with their launch vehicles. So the new generation of launch vehicles, of Long March launch vehicles, they use the same fairing diameter for different stages. And so you can have kind of interchangeable, almost like Lego piece parts, where you can say, well, let's build this rocket out of these fairings, and then we can take the same fairings and build a different rocket if we need a different rocket. And I think all of that modularity, all of that, let's say long-term planning, it was in some way exhibited with the recent Shenzhou 22 spacecraft launch. So as you know, there was the Shenzhou 20 where there was the space debris impact event. That spacecraft was stuck in the Chinese space station because it had cracked one of the, space debris had cracked the window. And Shenzhou 22, which was a backup duplicate of Shenzhou 21, which was launched at the end of October, Shenzhou 22 was able to be mobilized within a few weeks, and that was launched just last week. And so now you have the Shenzhou 20 astronauts came home on Shenzhou 21 spacecraft, stranding the Shenzhou 21 astronauts on the Chinese space station. But now this Shenzhou 22 spacecraft is attached to the Chinese space station, and the Shenzhou 21 astronauts will be able to repair Shenzhou 20, maybe using some of the equipment sent on Shenzhou 22, and also, as necessary, take Shenzhou 22 back to Earth. And so again, that whole thing was able to be arranged in just a few weeks, and I think that speaks volumes to the the preparedness, to the long-term thinking to some extent, and also to this modularity.
Right, given all this activity and the U.S. warning that, China's space advances are mind-boggling, especially the breakneck speed of it, what impact, if any, have sanctions, have restrictions on chips, of knowledge sharing, isolation? How has it impacted China's space program, if at all, or has it just sped it up because they find their own solutions to what they're trying to achieve?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, but also it's a little bit terrifying is probably too strong of a word, but let's say intimidating. When I was speaking with Chinese space industry interlocutors back in the late 2010s about this very question, the sort of the starting point for really cutting off relations was the Wolf Amendment, which was passed in the early 2010s in the U.S., and that explicitly forbid forbid NASA from collaborating with China using government money without explicit permission from Congress. And so that basically cut off most of China's space sector to the U.S. And around that time, Chinese state-owned space companies back then, they realized we need to develop all of this ourselves, and we need to make things as domestically built as possible. And commercial companies, I think, partly came about as a result of that, just this recognition that the SOEs can't do it all themselves. And so now if you look at, every so often you'll see an article published about a recently launched satellite, and they'll say, oh yeah, 95% of the parts in that satellite were domestically produced, and 100% of the critical systems or the high-tech systems, or whatever phrase you want to use, 100% of those were domestically produced. And so I think by the time, for example, the sanctions under the Trump administration, or Biden before that, I mean, by the time all of this came around, China's space sector had largely become a domestic affair for the most part. And you do still, for what it's worth, see some European suppliers selling into China. You see some other non-U.S. entities selling into China, but it tends to be either for very specific things or things that are not particularly high tech or otherwise that are just for whatever reason China has not built or developed them themselves. So I guess the short answer would be this decoupling that probably happened earlier in space than it did in other industries. It has led China to just kind of accelerate their own developments and create a more of a domestically focused industry.
All right. So given China's space advances, let me bring it back to Taiwan here. And what does Taiwan need to be thinking about right now, especially with regards to security, as we see China zoom ahead with its space advances, its satellite blocking, its, all the things that could possibly impact Taiwan? What does Taiwan need to think about with regards to how it develops its space program?
Oh, I think a couple of high-level ideas would be sovereign infrastructure development, and I've seen a lot of good steps taken in this direction. There's the small GEO program that's being done by Chunghwa Telecom. There's plans for a handful of low Earth orbit communication satellites, developing a homegrown rocket. I mean, these are all important things, and I think those are all steps in the right direction. I think that the other component would be regional or global collaboration. And this was one of the topics that was really on display at the APSEC conference back in Taipei last month, where I met your colleague. There were entities primarily from Korea, but then also from elsewhere in Asia Pacific, talking about the need for an Asia Pacific focused version of Starlink, or maybe more, accurately, of like an Iris squared, which is the European Union's response to Starlink. It's kind of a pan-European Starlink-like constellation, and accepting the reality that Starlink, or a constellation like Starlink, is a 10 plus billion US dollar project, and so a very small number of countries or jurisdictions are going to be able to justify building their own. And it's going to be the US, it's going to be China, it's going to be the European Union. And it's not going to be Taiwan or South Korea or Japan, because none of those three countries can justify spending 10 or 15 or $20 billion on a constellation that's only going to, of which 2% of it is going to cover any of those three countries. These are global projects. And so to have a global, or at least international, consortium of entities that say, we're going to group together and build infrastructure that can be used by all of us in this increasingly uncertain world, I think that's going to be essential, because at the end of the day, again, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, these countries they don't have the population or the economy to spend tens and tens of billions of US dollars per year on space. And so they're going to need to lean on one another and say, we're going to pool resources, we're going to pool engineers, we're going to deepen technological and educational ties, and we're going to try to build some things together.